Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. Takeshi Yamada had been walking for nearly 3 hours when he realized he could no longer hear the birds. The silence pressed against his ears like water, thick and suffocating. And somewhere in the back of his mind a voice whispered that he should turn around, that he should leave this place and never come back. But his feet kept moving forward, drawn by something he couldn't name, something that had been pulling at him for weeks now, a weight in his chest that grew heavier with each passing day. The trees around him were dense and dark, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost intentional, and the forest floor was carpeted with moss, so thick it swallowed the sound of his footsteps entirely. He had entered Aokigahara that morning with a small backpack, a bottle of water, and a photograph in his pocket, the edges worn soft from years of handling. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Takeshi was 32 years old, worked as an accountant in Tokyo, and had spent the last 5 years living in a studio apartment that overlooked a convenience store and a narrow alley where cats gathered at night. His life had become a series of routines: wake at 6, train at 7:15, office by 8:30, the same desk, the same fluorescent lights humming overhead, the same polite conversations with colleagues whose names he sometimes forgot. He ate lunch alone most days, usually a bento box from the kombini near his building, and in the evenings he would return to his apartment, heat up instant ramen, and watch television until his eyes grew heavy. It was a life that felt like waiting, though he couldn't have said what he was waiting for. His parents had passed away in a car accident when he was 27. His younger sister, Yuki, had been with them, and in the 5 years since, Takeshi had drifted through his days like a ghost, present but not really there, answering when spoken to but never quite connecting with the world around him. He had friends once, university classmates he would meet for drinks, but those friendships had faded over time. Not from any dramatic falling out, but simply from neglect, from his inability to reach out, to be present, to care. The photograph in his pocket was of Yuki, taken at a summer festival when she was 16, her face lit by lantern light, smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. He carried it everywhere. 3 weeks earlier, Takeshi had been riding the train home from work when he noticed a man standing near the doors, staring out at the passing darkness. There was nothing unusual about the man's appearance. Middle-aged, wearing a gray suit, briefcase in hand, but something about the way he stood, perfectly still, not swaying with the movement of the train, caught Takeshi's attention. The man's reflection in the window glass was oddly faint, almost transparent, and for a moment Takeshi thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the overhead fluorescence created strange shadows and distortions. But then the train pulled into a station and the doors opened, and the man stepped out onto the platform without ever turning around, without ever acknowledging that anyone else existed. Takeshi watched him walk toward the exit, his movements smooth and unhurried, and then the doors closed and the train moved on. It was such a small thing, barely worth remembering, but that night, Takeshi dreamed of Aokigahara Forest, of trees so dense they blocked out the sky, of paths that twisted and doubled back on themselves, of a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. He woke at 3 in the morning with his heart racing, and Yuki's name on his lips. The dream returned every night after that, always the same, always ending with him standing alone among the trees, knowing he was supposed to find something but not knowing what. By the end of the second week, He had started researching the forest online, reading about its history, about the hundreds of people who went there every year and never came back, about the volunteers who searched the woods each autumn, and the things they found hanging from the branches. He told himself he was just curious, that it was morbid fascination, and nothing more, but he knew that wasn't true. Something was calling him there. The morning he left for Aokigahara, Takeshi woke before his alarm and lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of rain against his window. He had taken the day off work, citing a doctor's appointment, and had packed his small backpack the night before with water, a flashlight, a compass he wasn't sure he knew how to use properly, and the photograph of Yuki. He dressed in dark clothes, jeans, and a jacket, and left his apartment just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The train ride took nearly 2 hours, and he spent most of it staring at his reflection in the window, wondering if he looked as empty as he felt. When he reached the station nearest to the forest, he bought a coffee from a vending machine and stood outside in the cool morning air, watching other travelers come and go. Businessmen and students and tourists with cameras, all of them moving with purpose, all of them knowing where they belonged. Takeshi finished his coffee, threw the can in a recycling bin, and started walking. The trail into Aokigahara began innocently enough, a well-maintained path with signs warning visitors to stay on marked routes, to not venture into the deeper parts of the forest. But Takeshi ignored the warnings and kept walking, following something that wasn't quite instinct and wasn't quite memory, something that felt like a hand gently guiding him forward. After an hour, the path narrowed and became less distinct, the ground uneven and covered with roots that seemed to reach up like fingers. And then the path disappeared entirely, and there was only the forest, dark and endless and waiting. Now, 3 hours in, Takeshi stood in a small clearing where the trees formed a rough circle and the moss grew in strange patterns, concentric rings that spiraled inward toward a bare patch of earth. The silence was absolute. He couldn't hear the wind, couldn't hear insects or animals, couldn't even hear his own breathing clearly, as if the air itself had thickened into something that absorbed sound. He took out his phone to check the time and found that he had no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the forest. But when he looked at the screen, he saw that the time display was wrong, flickering between different numbers, 3:15, then 7:42, then 1:08, cycling through, seemingly random times as if the device couldn't decide what was real. He turned it off and put it back in his pocket. The clearing felt wrong somehow. Not frightening exactly, but deeply uncomfortable. Like standing in a room where the proportions were slightly off, where the angles didn't quite add up. He walked to the center, to the bare patch of earth, and crouched down. The soil was dark and rich, almost black, and when he touched it with his fingers it was cold, much colder than it should have been. Something white caught his eye, half buried in the dirt, and he brushed the soil away to reveal a small piece of paper, folded many times into a tight square. His hands shook as he unfolded it, the paper brittle and yellowed with age, and when he smoothed it out, he saw writing, Japanese characters in faded ink, a single sentence that made his breath catch in his throat. "I'm sorry, I couldn't wait any longer." Takeshi stood up quickly, the paper clutched in his hand, and looked around, the clearing with new eyes. There were other things here, small objects half hidden in the moss and undergrowth, a wristwatch with a cracked face, a pair of glasses with one lens missing, a child's hair clip in the shape of a butterfly, all of them arranged in a loose circle around the bare earth, as if someone had placed them there deliberately, as if they were offerings or markers or warnings. He felt a coldness spreading through his chest. Not fear exactly, but something closer to recognition, as if he had seen this place before, as if he had always known it was here. He thought of the man on the train, of his transparent reflection in the window glass, and understood with sudden clarity that the man had been dead, that what he had seen was something that had once been alive but wasn't anymore. Something caught between worlds, still going through the motions of life without understanding that life had ended. He thought of his own reflection in the train window that morning, pale and indistinct, and wondered if he too had become something less than alive, if the 5 years since his family died had been a slow fading, a gradual disappearance that he hadn't noticed until now. The photograph of Yuki felt heavy in his pocket, a weight that seemed to grow with each passing second, and he took it out with trembling hands and looked at her face, at her smile frozen in that moment of summer festival joy, and felt tears running down his cheeks before he even realized he was crying. A sound broke the silence, so sudden and unexpected that Takeshi gasped and nearly dropped the photograph. It was a woman's voice, calling out somewhere in the forest, the words unclear but the tone unmistakable, desperate, pleading, "Help me, please, someone help me." Takeshi turned toward the sound, his heart hammering, and saw movement between the trees, a figure in white stumbling through the undergrowth, falling, getting up, falling again. He started toward her without thinking, his feet carrying him forward even as his mind screamed at him to stop, to stay in the clearing, to not go deeper into the forest. The figure disappeared behind a thick stand of trees, and he followed, pushing through branches that scratched at his face and hands, calling out, "Wait, I'm coming, hold on!" But the woman didn't respond, didn't slow down, just kept moving deeper and deeper into the darkness. He ran after her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the backpack bouncing against his shoulders, and then suddenly the ground dropped away beneath his feet, and he was falling, sliding down a steep slope covered in dead leaves and loose soil, grabbing at roots and rocks but finding no purchase, tumbling head over heels until he crashed into something solid and lay there stunned, staring up at a canopy so dense it blocked out the sky completely. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, could only lie there feeling the cold earth beneath him and the pain radiating through his body. Then he heard the voice again, closer now, just ahead, and he forced himself to sit up, to look around. He was at the bottom of a small ravine, the walls steep and covered with moss, and ahead of him the ground leveled out into another clearing, smaller than the first, where the trees grew in twisted shapes, and the air seemed darker somehow, thicker, as if light itself had trouble penetrating this place. The woman in white was standing in the center of the clearing with her back to him. She was perfectly still, her long black hair hanging down past her shoulders, her white dress stained with dirt and torn at the hem. Takeshi got to his feet slowly, every muscle aching, and took a step toward her. "Hello," he said, his voice sounding strange and muffled in the dense air. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond, didn't move at all, and he took another step closer, then another. "Excuse me," he said, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" Still nothing. He was close enough now to see that her feet were bare and muddy, that her hands hung at her sides with the fingers slightly curled, that she was breathing, her shoulders rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He reached out to touch her shoulder, to turn her around, and the moment his fingers made contact, she spun to face him with impossible speed, her movement so sudden and violent that he stumbled backward and fell. Her face was pale, bloodless, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, too sharp, and her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye, as if someone had filled the sockets with ink. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not human, a wet, rasping noise like wind through a tunnel, and Takeshi scrambled backward on his hands and feet, his throat tight with terror, his mind blank with the simple animal need to get away. The woman, the thing that looked like a woman, tilted its head to one side, studying him with those black eyes, and then it smiled, revealing teeth that were too long, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. It took a step toward him. Takeshi turned and ran, his body moving before his mind could process what he was doing, his feet slipping on the wet leaves and roots, but somehow keeping him upright. Behind him, he could hear footsteps, fast and light, keeping pace no matter how hard he pushed himself, and that rasping sound, that horrible wet breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care, just needed to move, to put distance between himself and that thing, to find a way out of this nightmare forest. Branches whipped at his face and arms, roots caught at his feet, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. But he kept running, his lungs burning, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. He burst through a line of trees and found himself on the edge of another slope, steeper than the first, dropping away into blackness. And he tried to stop, but his momentum carried him forward, and then he was falling again, tumbling down through the darkness, hitting rocks and trees, feeling something in his legs snap with a white-hot burst of pain, and then nothing. When Takeshi opened his eyes, he was lying on his back on flat ground, staring up at a sky that was the wrong color, a deep purple gray that seemed to pulse and shift like something alive. His leg was bent at an angle that made his stomach turn, and when he tried to move it, the pain was so intense that black spots danced across his vision. He lay still, breathing in short, shallow gasps, trying to understand where he was, what had happened. The forest around him looked different now. The trees twisted into impossible shapes, their trunks spiraling upward and then doubling back on themselves, their branches reaching down toward the ground like grasping fingers. The air smelled wrong, sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left too long in a vase. He could hear sounds now, where before there had been only silence, whispers, and rustling movements, footsteps circling him in the darkness, voices speaking in languages he almost understood, but not quite. He turned his head, ignoring the spike of pain from his neck, and saw figures moving between the trees, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all wearing white, all with that same pale, stretched skin and those same black eyes. They were watching him, waiting. He tried to speak, to ask them what they wanted, but his throat was too dry, his voice reduced to a croak. One of the figures detached itself from the others and walked toward him, moving with that same impossible smoothness he had seen in the woman, and, as it got closer, he saw that it was a man, middle-aged, wearing a gray suit, carrying a briefcase. The man from the train. The figure crouched beside him, tilting its head in that inhuman way, and when it spoke, its voice was a dry whisper that seemed to come from inside Takeshi's own skull. "You've been looking for us," it said. "You've been calling out in your dreams. We heard you. We've been waiting." Takeshi wanted to deny it, to say that he hadn't been looking for anything, that he had just come here because of the dreams, because of the photograph, because he didn't know where else to go. But the words died in his throat because he knew they would be a lie. He had been looking for this, for them, for whatever existed in this terrible place where the lost and the dead gathered in the darkness. He had been looking for an ending, for a way to stop feeling empty, to stop going through the motions of a life that felt like nothing but waiting. The figure reached out with one pale hand and touched Takeshi's forehead, its fingers cold and dry like paper, and suddenly he could see everything, all of it at once. Every person who had ever come to this forest looking for an ending, every moment of despair and loneliness and hopelessness that had driven them here, every final, thought as they tied the rope or swallowed the pills or simply lay down in the moss and waited for the cold to take them. He saw the woman in white, saw her real face beneath the mask, saw her walking into the forest 15 years ago after her husband died, saw her choosing a tree and standing beneath it and stepping off the world. He saw the man in the gray suit, saw him losing his job and his home and his family, saw him riding the train one last time before walking into the trees and never coming back. He saw hundreds of others, thousands, all of them trapped here in this in-between place, this pocket of reality where the boundary between life and death had worn thin, where those who came looking for an ending found something else instead, an eternal waiting, a forever darkness. And he saw Yuki. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, not as she had been in the photograph, but as she would be now if she had lived, 21 years old, her face gentle and sad. She wasn't one of the pale figures, wasn't trapped here with the others, but she was present somehow, watching him with eyes full of tears. "Brother," Yuki said, and her voice was soft and real and heartbreakingly familiar. "You can't stay here. This isn't your place." The figure holding Takeshi's forehead released him and stepped back, and the others in the clearing moved aside, creating a path through the trees. Takeshi tried to sit up and cried out as pain lanced through his broken leg, but somehow he managed to prop himself on his elbows, to look at his sister's spirit standing in the pale light. "I don't know how to leave," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to live without you, without them. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Yuki knelt beside him, and though she didn't touch him, he could feel her presence, warm and solid and real. "You're supposed to live," she said. "You're supposed to wake up and eat breakfast and go to work and make friends and fall in love and make mistakes and happy and be sad and be everything that a person is supposed to be. You're supposed to carry us with you, not chase after us. We're gone, brother. We died 5 years ago, and we're not coming back. And you staying here, you becoming like them, it won't change that. It won't bring us back. It will just add one more lost soul to a forest that already has too many." He wanted to argue, to say that living without them was too hard, that the emptiness was too much to bear. But looking at her face, he knew she was right. Knew that the 5 years he had spent drifting through his life like a ghost had been a kind of death already, a slow surrender that had brought him to this place, to this moment. The pale figures were watching him, waiting to see what he would choose, whether he would stay and join them in their eternal waiting, or whether he would turn away and walk back toward the light. Takeshi reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of Yuki, the edges worn soft, the colors faded but still visible, her smile still bright even after all these years. He looked at it for a long moment, memorizing every detail, and then he folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket, close to his heart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to Yuki, to his parents, to himself. "I'm sorry I forgot how to live." Yuki smiled, and for just a moment she looked exactly as she had at the summer festival, young and happy and full of light. "Don't forget us," she said. "But don't chase us either. Live enough for all of us." Her form began to fade, becoming transparent, and the pale figures in the clearing started to move away, drifting back into the trees. Their purpose here finished, their message delivered. Takeshi closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the sky above him was the right color, pale blue with clouds moving across it, and the trees were just trees, twisted and dark but natural, not the impossible shapes he had seen before. His leg was still broken, the pain sharp and constant but manageable now, real. He could hear birds singing somewhere in the distance, and wind moving through the branches, and his own breathing, loud and ragged but steady. He was still in Aokigahara forest, still lost somewhere in its depths, but he was back in the real world, back among the living. He pulled out his phone and found that it was working again, the time display steady, showing 2:30 in the afternoon. He had been in the forest for 6 hours. He dialed emergency services with shaking hands. The rescue team found him 3 hours later, following the signal from his phone, and carried him out on a stretcher. They asked him what happened, how he had broken his leg, why he had gone so deep into the forest, but he couldn't answer, couldn't find words to explain what he had seen, what he had experienced. They took him to a hospital in a nearby town where doctors set his leg and gave him painkillers and asked more questions he couldn't answer. He spent 2 nights there, lying in a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about pale figures and black eyes, and his sister's spirit standing in the clearing telling him to live. When they released him, he took a train back to Tokyo and returned to his studio apartment, to his familiar walls and his narrow bed, and his view of the convenience store and the alley where cats gathered. But something had changed. The apartment didn't feel empty anymore, or rather, it felt empty, but in a way that suggested possibility, space waiting to be filled rather than just absence. He went to work the next day, took his seat at his familiar desk, and when a colleague asked if he wanted to join them for lunch, he said yes. It was such a small thing, just agreeing to eat with other people, but it felt enormous, like taking a first step on a journey he had forgotten he was supposed to be making. That night, he called an old friend from university, someone he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, and they talked for an hour, awkward at first, but gradually finding their rhythm again. Takeshi still carried the photograph of Yuki in his pocket, still thought about his family every day, but the weight felt different now. Not a burden pulling him down, but an anchor, keeping him connected to something important, reminding him of who he was and where he came from and why he needed to keep moving forward. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But Aokigahara Forest is not the only place in Asia where the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin. There are other locations, other spaces where lost souls wander and where the unwary can stumble into encounters that challenge everything they understand about reality. In the highlands of Malaysia, perched on a mountaintop where fog rolls in thick and white and swallows the world whole, there exists a resort where travelers come seeking entertainment and escape. But sometimes they find something else entirely, something that wears a familiar face and walks the carpeted hallways late at night, looking for someone who will finally see her, finally acknowledge that she exists. This is a story about a place where joy and horror exist side by side, where families laugh and play games while just around the corner, in the shadows between the bright lights, something watches and waits with infinite patience. Chen Wei had been planning the family trip to Genting Highlands for months, carefully saving money from his salary, researching hotels and attractions, building up the excitement with his wife Mei Lin and their 2 children, 8-year-old daughter Ling and 5-year-old son Jun. They lived in Kuala Lumpur, in a modest apartment, in a busy neighborhood where the sounds of traffic and construction never really stopped, and Chen worked long hours as a manager at a shipping company, spending his days coordinating deliveries and managing schedules and answering emails that seemed to multiply faster than he could respond to them. Mei Lin worked part-time at a pharmacy while the children were in school, and in the evenings the family would gather in their small living room to eat dinner and watch television and go through the familiar routines that made up their life together. It was a good life, Chen told himself often, comfortable and stable, but sometimes he felt like he was running on a treadmill, working hard but never actually getting anywhere, and he wanted to give his family something special, something they would remember, a break from the routine that would remind them all that there was more to existence than work and bills and the same four walls every night. So, he planned the trip to Genting, 3 days and 2 nights at one of the resort hotels, with tickets to the theme park and the casino for him and Mei Lin after the children were asleep, and reservations at a nice restaurant for their anniversary dinner. The children were ecstatic when he told them, June jumping up and down on the sofa until Mei Lin told him to stop, Ling already making lists of all the rides she wanted to go on, and Chen felt a warm satisfaction spreading through his chest, a sense that he was doing something right, that he was being the kind of father and husband he wanted to be. They left early on a Friday morning, driving Chen's aging sedan up the winding mountain road as the city fell away below them and the air grew cooler and thinner. The children pressed their faces to the windows, watching the jungle slide past, pointing out monkeys in the trees and waterfalls cascading down rocky slopes. Mei Lin sat in the passenger seat with a travel guide open on her lap, reading aloud about the history of the resort, how it had been built in the 1960s, how it had grown over the decades into a massive complex of hotels and casinos and shopping centers and theme parks, a self-contained city perched on the mountaintop. Chen drove carefully, taking the hairpin turns slowly, and as they climbed higher, the fog began to appear, first in wisps that drifted across the road like ghost fingers, then in thick banks that reduced visibility to just a few meters. By the time they reached the resort, the world outside had disappeared entirely, swallowed by white mist that pressed against the windows and turned everything beyond the immediate surroundings into vague shapes and shadows. The hotel where they were staying was one of the older buildings, not as modern or luxurious as some of the newer additions to the resort, but well-maintained and affordable, and when they checked in, the lobby was full of families like theirs, parents with excited children, elderly couples, groups of young people laughing and taking selfies. Chen collected the key cards from the front desk, 2 plastic rectangles with the hotel logo printed on them, and they took the elevator up to their room on the 14th floor. The room was larger than Chen had expected, with 2 queen beds, a small sitting area, and a window that looked out over the fog-shrouded mountain. The children immediately claimed one of the beds and started jumping on it despite Mei Lin's protests, and Chen set down their luggage and went to the window to look out. He could see nothing but white, the fog so thick it seemed solid, and for a moment he had the unsettling feeling that the hotel was floating in empty space, that there was nothing beyond these walls but endless white void. He shook off the thought and turned back to his family, to the real and solid presence of his wife unpacking clothes and his children arguing over who would get which pillow, and the feeling passed. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the resort, walking through the endless corridors that connected the various buildings, past shops selling souvenirs and jewelry and electronics, past restaurants, offering every type of cuisine imaginable, past arcades full of flashing lights and electronic sounds. The children wanted to stop at everything, to look at every toy and candy display, and Chen found himself saying yes more often than he usually would, caught up in the holiday atmosphere, in the sense that normal rules didn't quite apply here. They had lunch at a food court where the children ate chicken rice, and Chen and Mei Lin shared a noodle dish, and then they went to the theme park, an indoor complex full of rides and games and attractions that seemed to stretch on forever. The theme park was crowded, packed with families and teenagers and tour groups, the air filled with music and screaming and laughter. Chen bought an all-day pass for the family, and they spent hours going from ride to ride, June nervous on the gentler attractions, Ling fearless on everything, wanting to go higher, faster, more thrilling. Mei Lin rode the carousel with June while Chen took Ling on a roller coaster that looped and twisted through artificial mountains and past animatronic creatures, and when they got off she was beaming, her eyes bright with excitement, begging to go again. They played carnival games, Chen winning Ling a stuffed panda that was nearly as big as she was, and ate cotton candy that turned their fingers sticky and their mouths blue. It was perfect. Exactly the kind of day Chen had hoped for, and watching his children's happy faces, he felt a deep contentment, a sense that all the long hours at work, all the stress and worry about money, it was all worth it for moments like this. As the afternoon wore on, the crowds in the theme park seemed to thin out, families leaving to rest before dinner, and Chen suggested they go on one more ride, a haunted house attraction that promised thrills and chills. Mei Lin was hesitant, worried it would be too scary for the children, but Ling insisted she wasn't afraid, and June, not wanting to seem like a baby in front of his older sister, agreed. They joined the short line outside the attraction, a building made to look like an old mansion, complete with fake cobwebs and creepy sound effects. The haunted house ride was a slow-moving walk-through. The visitors guided through darkened rooms where animatronic ghosts popped out from behind corners and holographic spirits floated in the air. June clung to Mei Lin's hand and hid his face whenever something jumped out, and Ling tried to act brave, but Chen could feel her gripping his arm tighter whenever the rooms got particularly dark. They were in a corridor lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them when Chen noticed another figure walking alongside them, a woman in a white dress, moving parallel to their group, but just far enough away that he couldn't see her face clearly. He assumed she was another visitor, part of a different group, but something about her struck him as odd, the way she moved without seeming to react to any of the scares, without looking at the animatronics or the other decorations, just walking steadily forward with her head down. They entered a room set up to look like an old parlor, full of antique furniture covered in dust and fake cobwebs, and Chen lost sight of the woman in white for a moment. Then he saw her again, standing in the corner of the room, perfectly still, and he realized she was facing them, though he still couldn't make out her features in the dim light. Something about her posture made him uncomfortable, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, and he hurried Ling along, wanting to get out of that room, away from that unsettling figure. Mei Lin didn't seem to have noticed, too focused on comforting June, who was now crying softly, and Ling was looking at a skeleton that rattled and shook in a glass case. They exited the haunted house back into the noise and light of the theme park, and June stopped crying almost immediately, embarrassed now by his tears. Chen looked back at the attraction's entrance, half expecting to see the woman in white emerge behind them, but the doorway was empty. He told himself it had just been part of the show, an actor in costume, but the image of her standing in the corner, facing them in the darkness, lingered in his mind. They spent another hour in the theme park, playing games and going on a few more gentle rides to help June forget about being scared. And then they returned to their hotel room to rest before dinner. The children were exhausted, their earlier excitement giving way to the inevitable crash, and they lay on their bed watching cartoons on the television, while Mei Lin took a shower and Chen sat in the chair by the window, looking out at the fog which had, if anything, grown even thicker. Night was falling now, the white mist taking on a grayish-purple tinge, and the lights of the resort created strange halos and reflections in the moisture. Chen could see the outline of another hotel building, across from theirs, its windows glowing yellow, and he found himself counting the floors, trying to figure out which level they were on, when he saw something that made him lean closer to the glass. In one of the windows of the opposite building, on what looked like the same floor they were on, a figure stood looking out, a woman in a white dress, and even from this distance, even through the fog, Chen could tell she was looking directly at him. He jerked back from the window, his heart suddenly racing, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. He sat very still for a moment, trying to rationalize what he had seen, telling himself it was just another guest, just someone else looking out at the fog. Nothing strange or unusual about that at all. But the image of the woman in the haunted house returned to him, the way she had stood in the corner facing them, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it had been the same person, the same dress, the same posture. Lin came out of the bathroom in a cloud of steam, wrapped in a towel, and asked him what he was doing. "Nothing," he said, just looking at the fog. She came to stand beside him, looking out at the thick white mist, and said it was beautiful in a way, peaceful, like they were cut off from the rest of the world. Chen agreed, not mentioning the figure he had seen, not wanting to worry her or sound foolish. They got ready for dinner, Chen putting on the one nice shirt he had brought, Lin wearing a dress she had bought specifically for this trip, and they woke the children, who were both cranky and resistant, until Lin promised they could have dessert after dinner. The restaurant Chen had made reservations at was in a different building, connected by one of the covered walkways that linked the various parts of the resort, and as they walked through the carpeted corridors, Chen found himself looking at every woman they passed, checking if she was wearing white, if her posture matched the figure he had seen. Dinner was pleasant, the restaurant dim and quiet, the food expensive but good, and the children behaved well, coloring on the placemats the staff provided while Chen and Lin talked about ordinary things, work and bills and plans for renovating their apartment kitchen. They ordered dessert, ice cream for the children, and coffee for themselves, and Chen was starting to relax, starting to forget about the woman in white, when Ling suddenly said, "Who is that lady?" Chen followed his daughter's gaze and saw a woman standing near the entrance to the restaurant, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar. She was wearing a white dress. From this angle, Chen couldn't see her face, but he could see her hands, pale and thin, hanging at her sides, and he felt a coldness spreading through his stomach. Lin turned to look and frowned. "I don't see anyone," she said. Ling pointed insistently. "There, by the pillar. She's looking at us." Chen stared at the spot where his daughter was pointing, and now he could see the woman clearly, see her standing in the shadows, her face turned toward their table, and even though the restaurant was dimly lit, he could make out her features, pale skin, dark eyes, long black hair falling past her shoulders, and an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile but simply blank, emotionless, as if she were looking at them the way one might look at a painting or a photograph, with mild curiosity but no real engagement. Then Lin said, "There's no one there, Ling. You're imagining things. I could not live knowing what they had done, knowing I had failed to protect him. And now I walk these paths searching for him, calling for him, but I cannot find him. I cannot reach him. The well is sealed and he is lost forever in the darkness, and I am trapped here, endlessly searching, endlessly calling, never finding." Kenji's legs felt weak, and he backed away from the well, from the woman, his rational mind telling him that this couldn't be real, that he was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion or dehydration or the disorienting effects of the fog. But another part of him, a deeper part that existed beneath logic and reason, knew that what he was witnessing was true, that this woman had been standing on this mountain for centuries, reliving her tragedy, searching for a child who had died so long ago that even the castle that required his sacrifice had crumbled to ruins. The woman reached out toward him, her pale hand extending from the sleeve of her white kimono, and Kenji saw that her fingers were translucent, that he could see the trees behind her through her body. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. Please, help me find him. Please tell someone what they did. Please make them remember." Kenji wanted to run, wanted to flee down the mountain and never come back, but something in her voice, in the raw, desperate grief that poured from her like water, held him in place. "What was your name?" he asked quietly. "What was your child's name?" The woman's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features as if no one had ever asked her this question before. "My name was Hanako," she said. "My son was called Takeshi. He was 3 years old. He liked to chase butterflies in the garden. He would laugh when I sang to him. He was everything to me, and they took him and threw him into the darkness and told me it was an honor." Kenji felt tears running down his own cheeks, felt the weight of her grief as if it were his own, and he nodded slowly. "I will remember," he said. "I will tell people what happened. I will make sure you and Takeshi are not forgotten." The woman, Hanako, looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, a sad, gentle smile that made her look young and vulnerable. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for stopping. Thank you for listening. No one has listened in so very long." Her form began to fade, becoming more transparent, more insubstantial, and the fog seemed to swallow her, to pull her back into itself. Kenji blinked and she was gone, vanished completely, and he was standing alone on the mountainside in thick fog with his flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the white. He looked down at the well, the ancient stones covered in moss and lichen, and then he took out his phone and, despite having no signal, took several photographs of it, documenting its location, its appearance. He used his GPS to mark the coordinates, even though the GPS was struggling through the fog and the tree cover. Then he carefully made his way down the mountain, moving slowly, checking his compass frequently, until finally he emerged from the fog onto the familiar trail that led to the parking area. His car was where he had left it, sitting alone in the lot, and he got in and sat for a long time with his hands on the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The rational part of his mind insisted it had been a hallucination, stress, the fog playing tricks, but he knew better. He had spoken with a ghost, had heard the story of a terrible crime committed centuries ago, had been entrusted with the responsibility of making sure that story was not forgotten. Over the following weeks, Kenji threw himself into research with an intensity that worried Akiko, who found him at his computer late into the night, surrounded by books and papers, his eyes red from exhaustion. He searched through historical records, castle documents, local legends, looking for any mention of Hanako and Takeshi, any reference to a child sacrifice at Hachioji Castle. The official histories said nothing, of course. Such things would not have been recorded in formal documents. But in the margins of old texts, in collections of local folklore, in the oral histories preserved by elderly residents, he found fragments. A story about a well on the castle grounds that was said to be cursed, where people heard crying on certain nights. A legend about a woman in white who walked the mountain paths searching for something she had lost. A mention in a personal diary from the Edo period of an old woman who claimed her grandmother had told her about a terrible thing done at the castle, a sacrifice made to ensure victory in battle. The pieces were scattered, incomplete, but they formed a pattern, a shadow of the truth that Hanako had told him. Kenji wrote an article for his blog, carefully researched and thoroughly documented, about the practice of human sacrifice in feudal Japan, about how such acts were sometimes performed at important sites, to appease the kami or ensure protection. He wrote about Hachioji Castle, about its history and its eventual fall, and he wrote about the legends of the woman in white and the crying herd near an old sealed well on the mountain. He wrote about Hanako and Takeshi, naming them, giving them back their identities, telling their story to anyone who would read it. The article was longer than anything he had written before, more personal, and he hesitated for a long time before publishing it, knowing that some people would dismiss it as superstitious nonsense, that others would question his credibility. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Hanako's face, heard her voice asking him to remember, to tell people what they had done, and he knew he had no choice. He published the article on a cool autumn evening, and then he closed his laptop and went to bed, lying awake in the darkness, wondering if he had done enough, if his words would matter to a spirit who had been searching for centuries. The response to the article surprised him. Dozens of comments appeared within the first few days, people sharing their own experiences on the mountain, their own encounters with the woman in white, their own feelings of profound sadness when visiting certain areas of the castle ruins. A historian from a local university reached out, saying she had been researching folk practices in the Sengoku period and wanted to discuss his findings. A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in making a short film about the legend, but the comment that affected Kenji most deeply came from an elderly man who said he was a descendant of one of the samurai families that had defended the castle, and that his grandmother had told him a story when he was a child, a story about a terrible thing her grandfather had witnessed, a child being thrown into a well while his mother screamed, and how the grandfather had carried the guilt of his silence until the day he died. The man thanked Kenji for bringing this story to light, for giving voice to something his family had been ashamed to acknowledge for generations. He said he hoped that Hanako could finally find peace, knowing that people remembered that her child's death had not been meaningless and forgotten. Kenji returned to Hachioji Castle one final time, on a clear day when the sun was bright and the fog absent, and he climbed the mountain slowly, stopping at the various levels of the ruins, paying his respects at the small shrines maintained by local volunteers. He found the well again, much easier to locate in daylight, and he saw that someone had been there recently, had cleared away some of the undergrowth and placed fresh flowers on the stones, white chrysanthemums that glowed in the sunlight. He stood there for a long time, thinking about Hanako and Takeshi, about the terrible choices people made in times of war, about how pain could echo across centuries if no one was willing to acknowledge it, to name it, to remember. He spoke aloud, his voice soft but clear. "I kept my promise," he said. "People know your names now. People remember what happened. I hope that brings you some measure of peace." The wind moved through the trees, a gentle rustling sound, and Kenji felt something shift in the air around him, felt a presence that had been heavy and sorrowful become lighter, less burdened. He couldn't say whether Hanako's spirit had truly found peace, whether his efforts had made any real difference in the supernatural sense, but he felt that something had changed, that by bearing witness, by listening and remembering and telling the story, he had honored a debt that the living owed to the dead. He never saw Hanako again, never encountered her ghost on subsequent visits to the mountain, and he heard from other hikers that the sightings of the woman in white had become less frequent, less intense, as if she had finally been able to rest. Kenji continued his blog, continued visiting castles and historical sites, but Hachioji remained special to him, a place where he had learned something important about the responsibility of remembering, about the weight of history, and the importance of giving voice to those who had been silenced. He sometimes thought about that foggy evening, about following a ghost through the mist, about standing at the edge of an ancient well and hearing a mother's grief that had lasted for centuries. He thought about how easy it would have been to dismiss it, to rationalize it away, to not listen, to not care. But he had stopped. He had listened. He had remembered. And perhaps that was all any ghost really wanted, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have someone bear witness to their suffering and say yes. This happened, this mattered, you are not forgotten. In a world that moved so quickly, that was always rushing forward toward the next thing, sometimes the greatest gift you could give was simply to stop, to listen, to remember, to honor the dead by carrying their stories forward into the light. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories we have for you tonight are different from what you have heard so far. They are quieter in some ways, more intimate, but they carry a darkness that is perhaps more disturbing because it feels so close to ordinary life, so close to the kinds of experiences anyone might have without realizing the danger they are in. These are stories about encounters that begin innocently, that seem like nothing more than coincidence or chance meetings, but that reveal themselves slowly to be something far more sinister, far more strange. They are the kind of stories that make you question your own memories, your own experiences, wondering if you too have brushed against something supernatural and simply not recognized it for what it was. They are stories that stay with you long after the telling ends, that make you look twice at strangers on the street, that make you wonder what might be watching from the shadows of your own familiar world. Yuki Tanaka had been exploring abandoned buildings in Tokyo for 2 years, documenting them with her camera, posting photographs on social media under an anonymous account that had gained a modest following among urban exploration enthusiasts. She was 24 years old, worked as a graphic designer for a small advertising agency, and lived alone in a tiny apartment in Nakano, where the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' conversations and the rent consumed half her monthly salary. The urban exploration had started as a way to find interesting subjects to photograph, empty spaces that had been left behind by the city's constant growth and change. But it had become something more, an obsession that pulled at her, even when she knew she should stop, when she knew that what she was doing was technically illegal and potentially dangerous. There was something addictive about entering spaces that had been abandoned, about walking through rooms that still held traces of the people who had once occupied them, about the silence and the decay and the sense of being somewhere you were not supposed to be. She always went alone, despite warnings from other explorers on the forums she frequented, despite knowing that if something went wrong there would be no one to help her. She preferred it that way, preferred the solitude, the sense of being completely alone with the ghosts of these empty places. The hospital in Shinjuku had been on her list for months, a 6-story building that had been abandoned for 15 years, standing empty in the middle of a neighborhood that was otherwise vibrant and crowded. She had researched its history online, finding that it had been a private psychiatric hospital that closed in the late 2000s after a series of scandals involving patient abuse and suspicious deaths. The details murky and contradictory depending on which source you read. Some articles claim that a doctor had been conducting unauthorized experiments. Others said that patients had been neglected to the point of starvation. Others hinted at something darker, something that had never been fully investigated or brought to light. The building had been slated for demolition multiple times, but the plans always fell through, funding issues or legal complications, and it continued to stand empty, its windows broken, its walls covered in graffiti, its grounds overgrown with weeds. Yuki had seen photographs other explorers had taken inside, had read their accounts of the experience, and almost all of them mentioned feeling uncomfortable, feeling watched, feeling like they needed to leave quickly even though nothing explicitly threatening had happened. Several people reported hearing sounds, footsteps, and doors closing, and what might have been voices speaking in distant rooms. One explorer claimed to have seen a figure in a white coat standing at the end of a hallway, but when he approached, it was gone. Yuki told herself, these were just stories, exaggerations meant to make the exploration seem more exciting. But she couldn't deny the thrill of anticipation she felt, the nervous energy that made her hands shake slightly as she packed her camera bag. She waited until late afternoon to make her approach, timing it so she would enter during the golden hour when the light was best for photography, but still have time to explore before darkness fell. The hospital was surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut in several places by previous explorers, and Yuki slipped through one of the gaps easily, her small frame allowing her to move through tight spaces without difficulty. The grounds were overgrown, tall grass and bushes pressing in from all sides, and the building itself looked worse up close than it had in photographs, the concrete walls stained with water damage and mold, the windows empty of glass, gaping like eye sockets. She approached the main entrance, a set of double doors that hung open at odd angles, one door completely off its hinges, and paused for a moment, feeling the familiar flutter of nervousness and excitement in her stomach. Then she stepped inside. The interior was dark despite the broken windows, the afternoon sunlight barely penetrating the depths of the building, and Yuki turned on the flashlight she had attached to her camera, sweeping the beam across the entrance hall. The floor was covered in debris, broken ceiling tiles and scattered papers and what looked like pieces of medical equipment, and the walls were covered in layers of graffiti, tags and symbols and crude drawings that overlapped each other in a chaotic palimpsest. The air smelled of mold and decay and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Yuki couldn't quite identify. She moved forward carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down, aware that the floor might be unstable, that there could be holes or weak spots that would give way beneath her. The entrance hall opened into a larger waiting area, where plastic chairs were still arranged in neat rows, as if patients might arrive at any moment, and Yuki took her first photographs, capturing the way the light fell through the broken windows and created patterns on the dusty floor, the way the chairs cast long shadows that looked almost like people sitting in them. She spent the next hour exploring the first floor, moving through examination rooms and offices and supply closets, all of them empty, but for debris and the occasional piece of abandoned equipment. She found patient files scattered on the floor in one room, the paper yellowed and water damaged, the handwriting faded but still partially legible, and she photographed several pages, zoomed in on the names and dates and brief medical notes that hinted at the lives these documents represented. In another room, she found restraints still attached to a hospital bed, the leather straps cracked and brittle with age, and she felt a coldness in her chest looking at them, imagining what it must have been like to be strapped down in this place, to be held against your will in the darkness. The forum posts had mentioned that the worst parts of the hospital were on the upper floors, that the 4th and 5th floors in particular felt oppressive, dangerous in ways that were hard to articulate, and Yuki found herself drawn upward, despite, or perhaps because of, the warnings. She located a stairwell at the back of the building, the metal stairs rusted but still solid, and began to climb. The second floor was similar to the first, empty rooms and scattered debris and the omnipresent smell of decay, but the third floor was different. Yuki felt the change as soon as she stepped into the hallway, felt something shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness in the air that made it slightly harder to breathe. The hallway was darker than the floors below, fewer broken windows to let in light, and her flashlight beam seemed weaker somehow, less effective at pushing back the shadows. She moved slowly, photographing as she went, and noticed that the graffiti here was different, less playful, more disturbing. Images of faces with distorted features, words written in what looked like deliberately shaky handwriting, Help me. Make it stop. They won't let us leave. Yuki told herself it was just urban explorers trying to add to the creepy atmosphere, but something about the handwriting, about the desperation that seemed to radiate from the words, made her uneasy. She entered a room that had clearly been used for group therapy, a circle of chairs facing each other, and in the center of the circle someone had drawn a symbol on the floor in what looked like black paint, a complex geometric pattern that hurt her eyes to look at directly. She took a photograph and then moved on quickly, wanting to get away from that room, from the way the chairs seemed to be facing her, watching her. The fourth floor was worse. Yuki almost turned back when she reached the top of the stairs and saw the hallway stretching ahead, darker than any space she had explored before, her flashlight seeming to illuminate only a few meters ahead before the beam was swallowed by shadows. But she had come this far, had invested this much time and effort, and she wanted to see what was up here, wanted to capture whatever images might be worth the risk. She moved forward, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and began opening doors at random. Most of the rooms were empty, completely bare of furniture or equipment, just 4 walls and a floor and a ceiling, and the overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened here. In one room, she found scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges in the plaster that looked like they had been made by human fingernails, covering every surface from floor to ceiling, and she stood in the doorway staring at them, trying to imagine the state of mind someone would need to be in to do this, the hours or days or weeks it must have taken. She didn't photograph this room. She closed the door and moved on. At the end of the hallway there was a door that was different from the others, a heavy metal door with a small window reinforced with wire mesh, and a sign that was still partially legible despite the water damage and mold, isolation ward. Yuki stood in front of this door for a long time, her hand on the handle, feeling a strong instinctive reluctance to open it, a voice in her head telling her to turn around, to go back downstairs, to leave this building and never return. But the curiosity was stronger than the fear, the need to see, to know, to document, and she pulled the handle down and pushed. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, metal scraping against metal, and beyond it was darkness so complete that her flashlight seemed to make no difference at all. She stepped through, and the door swung shut behind her, with a heavy clang that made her jump, and then she was standing in the isolation ward, with her heart hammering and her breath coming fast and shallow. The ward was a long corridor with cells on either side, small rooms with no windows and heavy doors that could be locked from the outside, and Yuki moved down the corridor slowly, shining her light into each cell as she passed. Most were empty, just bare concrete and the occasional stain on the floor that might have been rust or might have been something else. But then she reached a cell where the door stood open and there was someone inside. A woman in a hospital gown, sitting on the floor in the corner with her back to the door, her long black hair hanging down and obscuring her face. Yuki froze, her mind racing, trying to process what she was seeing. There shouldn't be anyone here. The building had been abandoned for 15 years. No one lived here. No one stayed here. And yet here was a person, sitting motionless in the darkness. Yuki's first instinct was to call out, to ask if the woman was okay, if she needed help, but something stopped her. Something about the absolute stillness of the figure, the way she sat without moving at all, not even breathing, as far as Yuki could tell. Yuki took a step back, then another, moving as quietly as possible, and the woman's head tilted slightly, just a few degrees, as if listening. Yuki held her breath, not making a sound, and slowly the woman's head tilted back to its original position. Yuki continued backing away, toward the door she had entered through, and her foot came down on something that made a small cracking sound, a piece of glass or plastic breaking under her weight. The woman's head snapped around, turning to face the doorway, and Yuki saw her face in the flashlight beam. It was gray, the color of old concrete, and the features were wrong, the proportions slightly off, the eyes too large and too far apart, the mouth too small and too high on the face. It wasn't a human face. Or it was a human face that had been distorted, changed, made into something else. The woman stood up in one smooth motion, no effort required, as if she weighed nothing at all, and she turned fully toward Yuki and opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not a voice, not a scream, but something between the two, a wet rasping noise that seemed to fill the entire corridor, and Yuki broke and ran. She ran back down the corridor, her flashlight bouncing wildly, illuminating the cells on either side in brief flashing glimpses. And in those glimpses, she saw that the cells were not empty anymore, that there were figures in every one, standing at the doors, watching her pass. All of them with those same gray faces and wrong proportions and too large eyes. She hit the metal door at the end of the corridor with her shoulder, desperate to get out, and the handle wouldn't move, wouldn't turn. The door locked, or stuck, or sealed somehow. Behind her, she could hear footsteps, many footsteps, moving toward her with that same smooth, gliding motion, and she yanked at the handle, threw her weight against the door, screamed for help, even though she knew there was no one to hear her. Then the door gave way, swinging open so suddenly that she fell through and landed hard on the hallway floor outside, and she scrambled to her feet and ran for the stairs, not looking back, not stopping, her only thought to get out of this building, to get away from whatever those things were. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her camera bag banging against her hip, and burst out into the 3rd-floor hallway running at full speed. Behind her, she heard the stairwell door open and those footsteps beginning to descend, following her, and she ran harder, pushing through the pain in her legs and lungs. She reached the ground floor and sprinted for the entrance, past the waiting room with its rows of empty chairs, past the debris and graffiti, out through the broken doors into the late afternoon sunlight. She didn't stop running until she was through the gap in the fence, out on the street, surrounded by normal people going about their normal lives, and only then did she stop, doubling over with her hands on her knees, gasping for air, her whole body shaking. She looked back at the hospital building and saw nothing. No movement in the windows, no figures emerging from the entrance, just an empty, abandoned structure sitting silent and still in the middle of the city. Yuki went home and tried to process what had happened, tried to convince herself that she had imagined it, that fear and darkness and her own expectations had created hallucinations, that there was a rational explanation for everything she had seen. But when she reviewed the photographs on her camera, scrolling through the images she had taken before reaching the 4th floor, she found something that made her blood run cold. In the photograph of the 3rd-floor therapy room, the one with the circle of chairs and the symbol drawn on the floor, there was someone sitting in one of the chairs. She hadn't seen anyone when she took the picture, had been completely alone in that room. But in the image, there was clearly a figure, a woman in a hospital gown with long black hair obscuring her face, sitting motionless in one of the chairs, facing the camera. Yuki zoomed in on the image, her hands trembling, and saw that the figure's hospital gown was the same as the one worn by the woman in the isolation ward, that the posture was identical, head down, hair covering the face. She deleted the photograph immediately, then deleted all the photographs from the hospital, then formatted her memory card completely, wanting no trace of that place, no connection to whatever she had encountered there. She never posted about the experience online, never told the other urban explorers what she had seen, and she stopped exploring abandoned buildings entirely, deleted her social media accounts, and put her camera away in a closet where she wouldn't have to look at it. She tried to return to normal life, to focus on her work and her friends and the everyday concerns that had seemed so important before. But sometimes at night, lying in her narrow bed in her tiny apartment, she would think about that isolation ward, about the cells full of figures with gray faces and wrong proportions, and she would wonder if they were still there, still waiting in the darkness, or if they had moved on, if they were now walking through other abandoned buildings, other forgotten spaces, waiting for the next explorer to stumble across them. She wondered if what she had seen was trapped in that hospital, or if it was something that could spread, that could move through the city, infecting other abandoned places, turning them into hives of whatever those things were. She never went back to find out, never went near that neighborhood again, but she heard from other explorers, saw posts on forums she still occasionally visited, about how the hospital had become somehow more dangerous, how people who entered now reported seeing figures in the hallways, how someone had been found outside the building in a state of complete psychological breakdown, babbling about gray faces and isolation wards and things that looked human but weren't. The building was finally demolished 6 months after Yuki's visit, torn down and replaced with a parking structure, and she felt a measure of relief when she heard the news. But the relief was incomplete, because she knew that demolishing the building didn't necessarily destroy what had been inside it, that some presences didn't need physical structures to exist, that they could linger in the spaces between things, in the gaps and shadows where normal people didn't look. And she knew that somewhere in Tokyo, in other abandoned hospitals or schools or apartments, those same figures might be waiting, sitting in silence, heads down, hair covering their faces, waiting for the next person to find them, to see them, to run screaming into the light. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. Abandoned hospitals are not unique to Japan. Every country has them. Buildings that once housed the sick and the dying, now left empty to decay. And sometimes what remains in these places is not just architecture and debris, but something else, some echo of suffering that refuses to dissipate. Taiwan, too, has such places, remnants of its complex history, buildings that served dark purposes during different eras of occupation and control. And among these, the old prison in Taipei stands as perhaps the most notorious, a place where countless people were held, interrogated, tortured, and in many cases, never seen again. The prison was closed decades ago, turned into a historical site, a museum meant to educate people about the crimes of the authoritarian past. But there are stories about what happens there after the museum closes, about a particular spirit that walks the cell blocks, and interrogation rooms, about a woman in a white dress who appears to visitors and museum staff, who stands in corners watching, who follows people through the exhibits, who sometimes reaches out as if trying to communicate something urgent, something that cannot wait. David Chen had been working as a night security guard at the old Taipei Prison Museum for 3 months when he first saw the woman in white. He was 31 years old, had served in the military for his mandatory service, and then worked a series of odd jobs, security positions mostly, before landing this one, which paid better than most and required relatively little effort. The museum closed at 5 in the evening, and David's shift started at 6, and for most of the night he simply walked the grounds, checked the locks on the doors, monitored the security cameras, and sat in the small office near the entrance, reading or watching videos on his phone. The prison was spread across several buildings, cell blocks and administrative offices and interrogation rooms and execution chambers, all of them now filled with exhibits and historical information and photographs of the people who had been imprisoned here during the White Terror period. when the government had arrested tens of thousands of suspected dissidents and subjected them to imprisonment, torture, and execution. It was depressing material, walking through these spaces every night, seeing the tiny cells where people had been kept in solitary confinement for months or years, seeing the instruments that had been used for torture, seeing the photographs of young faces, students, and intellectuals, and ordinary people who had simply been in the wrong place or said the wrong thing, and who had disappeared into this prison and never emerged. David lived with his girlfriend Amy in an apartment in Zhongshan district, and they had been together for 2 years, talking vaguely about marriage but never quite committing to the idea. Amy worked as a nurse at a hospital, long shifts that left her exhausted, and they didn't see each other as much as David would have liked. Their schedules misaligned in ways that made it difficult to maintain the relationship. David felt like he was drifting, like his life was happening around him rather than to him, like he was just going through motions without any clear direction or purpose. The night security job fit this feeling perfectly. Hours spent alone in empty buildings, watching time pass, waiting for his shift to end so he could go home and sleep through the day while Amy was at work. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find something better, that this was just a placeholder while he figured out what he actually wanted to do with his life. But 3 months had turned into 6, and he was starting to suspect that temporary might become permanent. The first time he saw the woman in white, David was doing his regular patrol through the cell blocks, walking slowly down the long corridors lined with cells on either side, his flashlight sweeping across the bars and the small spaces beyond. It was past midnight, the museum completely empty and silent, except for the sound of his own footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. He reached the end of one corridor and turned to walk back, and that's when he saw her, standing at the far end of the hallway, just standing there in the middle of the corridor. A woman wearing a white dress that looked old-fashioned, maybe from the 1950s or 60s. David stopped, confused, because the museum was locked and there should be no one else here, no visitors, no staff, just him. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice sounding strange and too loud in the empty space. "The museum is closed. You need to leave." The woman didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there looking in his direction, though David couldn't make out her face from this distance in the dim lighting. He started walking toward her, one hand reaching for his clations. Radio to call the other security guard, who was supposed to be monitoring the cameras from the main office, and as he got closer, the woman turned and walked into one of the cells, disappearing from view. David reached the cell and looked inside, shining his flashlight through the bars, and saw nothing, the small space completely empty, just bare concrete walls and a thin sleeping mat on the floor. He checked the cell door, and it was locked, as all the cell doors were locked. Visitors weren't allowed to enter the cells themselves, just look in from the corridor. There was no way the woman could have gotten inside, no way she could have disappeared. David stood there for a long moment, trying to rationalize what he had seen, telling himself it must have been a trick of the light, a shadow that his tired brain had interpreted as a person. He continued his patrol, checking all the cells more carefully now, but found nothing unusual, no signs that anyone else was in the building. When he returned to the office, he checked the security camera footage, rewinding to the time when he had seen the woman, and the cameras showed him walking down the corridor alone, showed him stopping and looking at something, showed him approaching an empty cell. There was no woman in white, no figure standing in the hallway, just him, alone in the darkness, talking to nothing. He didn't mention the incident to anyone, not to Amy, not to his coworker, not wanting to sound foolish or superstitious. But over the following weeks, he saw the woman several more times, always in different parts of the museum, always wearing the same white dress, always disappearing when he tried to approach her. He saw her standing in the exercise yard, looking up at the sky. He saw her sitting on a bench in the corridor outside the interrogation rooms, her hands folded in her lap. He saw her standing in the corner of the execution chamber, facing the wall. Each time he tried to approach her, to get close enough to see her face, to ask her who she was and how she was getting into the locked museum, and each time she would turn away or step into a shadow or simply vanish, and the security cameras would show only David, alone, reacting to something that wasn't there. He started to research the history of the prison more carefully, reading through the exhibit materials during his downtime, looking for any mention of a woman in white, any story that might explain what he was seeing. What he found disturbed him more than the sightings themselves. During the White Terror period, many women had been imprisoned in this facility, accused of being communist sympathizers or family members of accused dissidents, and many of them had been subjected to brutal interrogations and torture. One woman in particular appeared repeatedly in the historical records, a woman named Lin Mingling, who had been arrested in 1963 for supposedly being part of a reading group that discussed banned books. She had been 24 years old, a teacher at an elementary school, engaged to be married. She was brought to this prison and held in solitary confinement for 6 months, interrogated repeatedly, and according to the records, she had maintained her innocence throughout, insisting that the reading group was just friends discussing literature, nothing political, nothing dangerous. She was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison, but she died after only 2 years, officially from illness, though there were hints in the records that her death had been more complicated than that she had been found hanging in her cell, that there were questions about whether it had been suicide or something else. There were photographs of Lin Mingling in the museum exhibits, a young woman with a gentle face and sad eyes, wearing a white dress in one of the photos, taken before her arrest. David stared at the photograph for a long time, feeling a cold certainty spreading through his chest, and then he went back to his patrol, walking through the cell blocks with new eyes, new understanding. That night he saw the woman again, standing in the corridor outside the interrogation rooms, and this time, instead of approaching her, he simply stood still and watched. She was looking at one of the doors, the one that led to interrogation room 3, and her posture conveyed something that David could only interpret as longing or sorrow, a deep, emotional weight that seemed to make the air around her heavy. David spoke quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Lin Mingling," he said, using the name from the records. "Is that you? Are you Lin Mingling?" The woman turned toward him, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. It was the face from the photograph, young and gentle and sad, but marked now by suffering, by pain that had etched itself into her features, and her eyes, when they met his, were full of something that looked like desperation, like a need so profound it had transcended death. She raised one hand and pointed at the door to interrogation room 3, then looked back at David, her meaning clear, even without words. David hesitated, knowing that the interrogation rooms were supposed to remain locked, that staff weren't supposed to enter them outside of guided tours, but something in the woman's expression compelled him. He walked to the door and unlocked it with his master key, the door swinging open with a creak. The interrogation room was small and bare, just a metal table and 2 chairs and walls that were still stained with what might have been blood despite decades of cleaning and renovation. The woman, the ghost of Lin Mingling, walked past him into the room and went to the far wall, placing her hand on a specific spot about chest height. David followed her, confused about what she was trying to show him, and watched as she tapped her fingers against the wall 3 times, a clear, deliberate gesture. Then she stepped back and looked at him expectantly. David examined the wall where she had indicated, running his hands over the surface, feeling for anything unusual. The wall was concrete, painted over many times, and at first he felt nothing out of the ordinary. But then his fingers found a small irregularity, a place where the paint seemed thicker, where there was a very slight indentation beneath multiple layers. He pressed on it and felt something give slightly, and he took out his phone and used the flashlight function to examine the spot more closely. There was definitely something there, something that had been covered over, plastered, and painted to hide it. David looked at Lin Mingling's ghost, and she nodded, a small movement of encouragement, and he understood that she wanted him to open it, to reveal whatever was hidden behind this wall. He didn't have the tools with him to do it now, but he took photographs of the exact location, documented it carefully, and when he looked up to thank her, to tell her he understood, she was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been there. The next day, during normal museum hours, David spoke with the museum director, a middle-aged woman named Miss Wang, who took her responsibility as keeper of this historical site very seriously. He told her about the irregularity in the wall, not mentioning the ghost, just saying he had noticed something during his patrol and thought it should be investigated. Miss Wang was skeptical, but agreed to have someone look at it, and 2 days later, a team of preservationists came to examine the wall in interrogation room 3. They confirmed David's finding, agreed that there was something behind the layers of plaster and paint, and with the museum director's permission, they carefully removed the covering, working slowly to avoid damaging whatever might be underneath. What they found was a small recess that had been carved into the concrete, and inside the recess was a bundle wrapped in cloth, brittle with age, and carefully hidden. The preservationists removed the bundle with gloved hands and unwrapped it slowly, revealing a stack of papers, letters written in careful handwriting, dated from 1963 and 64. The years Lin Mingling had been imprisoned here. The letters were heartbreaking, messages written to Lin Mingling's fiancé, telling him she loved him, telling him she was innocent, telling him to move on with his life if she didn't survive this place. There were also letters written to her parents, to her students, to friends, all of them expressing the same themes: love, innocence, a desperate need to be believed, to be remembered as something more than a political prisoner, to be seen as a person who had mattered. The letters had never been sent, of course, prisoners weren't allowed to send mail, and Lin Mingling must have hidden them in the wall during one of her interrogation sessions, scratching out the recess slowly over many sessions, hiding the letters there in hopes that someday, somehow, someone would find them and know her story. Miss Wang was deeply moved by the discovery, immediately began making plans to include the letters in the museum exhibits, to add Lin Mingling's story to the historical record in a more complete way. She thanked David for his sharp eyes, for noticing something that everyone else had missed for decades. David returned to his night shift and never saw Lin Mingling's ghost again. He walked the same corridors, checked the same cells, passed by the interrogation rooms, but she didn't appear, didn't stand in corners watching him, didn't point to walls or try to communicate. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness about her absence, relief that he no longer had to deal with the unsettling experience of encountering a ghost, sadness that he would never again see her face, never again have that strange connection with someone who had suffered so much and been forgotten for so long. He thought about the letters often, about what it must have been like for Lin Mingling to write them, knowing she might never be free, knowing that the people she loved might never read her words, but writing them anyway because the alternative was to give up completely, to let the prison and the interrogators and the whole system erase her identity, her humanity. The act of hiding those letters had been an act of resistance, a way of saying, I existed, I mattered, My love was real. My life had meaning. And you cannot take that away from me, no matter what you do to my body. And now, decades later, her resistance had succeeded. Her words had been found. Her story would be told. The museum created a new exhibit around Lin Mingling's letters, placing them in protective cases with translations and historical context, and the exhibit became one of the most visited parts of the museum. People lining up to see these fragile papers that had survived against all odds. David sometimes walked through during the day before his shift started, watching visitors read the letters, seeing how they reacted, how some people cried, how others stood in silence for long minutes, just staring at Lin Mingling's careful handwriting. He felt proud to have been part of bringing this story to light, felt like maybe his drifting life had found a purpose, even if just for a moment, even if just by chance. He and Amy got engaged a few months later, started making real plans for their future instead of just talking vaguely about someday. And David enrolled in night classes at a university, studying history, thinking maybe he could become a teacher or a museum curator, someone who helped preserve and share these important stories. He continued working the night shift at the prison museum, but it felt different now, less like marking time and more like standing guard over something meaningful, protecting these spaces where terrible things had happened, but where the people who suffered had refused to be forgotten. He never told anyone about seeing Lin Mingling's ghost, about how she had led him to the hidden letters, about the desperate expression on her face when she pointed to the wall. Some things were better left private, better kept as personal experiences that didn't need to be explained or justified or proven. But he knew what he had seen, knew that Lin Mingling had been trapped here for decades, unable to move on because her story remained untold, her words unread, her identity reduced to a name on a list of prisoners, and that by finding those letters, by bringing them to light, he had freed her in some small way, had allowed her to finally rest. He thought about this sometimes during his patrols, walking the dark corridors alone, and he would whisper thank you into the silence, not sure if anyone was listening, but saying it anyway. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for showing me. Thank you for letting me help. The prison remained a heavy place, full of sadness and suffering that had seeped into the walls over decades, but it was also now a place of witness, of memory, of resistance, and David felt honored to be part of that, to stand guard over these stories and make sure they were never forgotten again. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.